Imagine, just for a moment, that you are standing on a ridge overlooking a valley. And it's a valley you've heard about literally your entire life, but have never actually seen.
Right, because you grew up in exile.
Exactly. You've grown up in exile. You were raised on these grand, sweeping stories about the unparalleled glory of your homeland's capital, the
Mhm.
majestic skyline, the insurmountable walls, the absolute architectural perfection of your people's sacred center.
It's basically mythological to them at this point.
Yeah, exactly. But then you finally arrive, right? After this incredibly brutal months-long trek across these bandit-infested trade routes. And the reality just hits you. There is no skyline.
Yeah.
There are no walls. The capital is just this completely leveled heap of charred, blackened limestone. I mean, the once glorious temple, the absolute center of your ancestors' universe, is literally just a crater overgrown with thorns.
It's devastating.
It is. And to make it worse, the surrounding nations, the people who basically moved into the vacuum while your grandparents were dragged away in chains, they're standing on the edges of this ruin, openly hostile to the fact that you've returned.
It is the ultimate existential crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, you are looking at the total erasure of a national identity. You have no king, you have no standing army.
Right.
The infrastructure is just gone, and the institutions that defined your relationship with God and the world are completely non-existent. You're literally standing in the dust of a dead civilization.
Yeah. And the question that must have been echoing in the minds of those returning refugees is, how in the world do a people rebuild their entire worldview from scratch? Like, how do you survive when all the physical anchors of your faith are just gone?
That is the big question.
So today we are looking at how a completely decimated people essentially invented a new way to exist. We're going to solve that historical mystery by taking a deep dive into the Book of Ezra.
Which is such a rich text.
It really is. And to do that, we aren't just reading it casually. We have a fascinating stack of sources today. Specifically, we're using an incredibly rigorous seminary-level Old Testament survey course, combined with the original Hebrew and Aramaic text from the BHS, the Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia.
Right, getting into the original languages.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to follow the source's comprehensive roadmap. We're going to explore the historical foundations, the literary architecture, the intertextual connections, and ultimately the theological implications of the text.
It's a huge undertaking, but it's so worth it.
Now, quick impartiality disclaimer for you listening. This provided material operates strictly from a conservative evangelical perspective.
Right.
We are stepping into this specific theological framework to impartially understand its arguments and insights.
Right.
We aren't endorsing this viewpoint, politically or otherwise, but rather we're unpacking it to see exactly how this perspective interprets the ancient text as a living, breathing blueprint for survival.
Which is a really crucial lens to look through. Because, I mean, if you read Ezra simply as this dusty, bureaucratic ledger of ancient Persian tax records...
Which it can kind of feel like sometimes.
Right, it totally can. But if that's all you see, you miss the profound vibrating tension right beneath the surface. This framework treats the text as a highly sophisticated, cohesive theological document.
Yeah.
One that makes massive claims about global geopolitics, divine sovereignty, and, honestly, how human beings interact with God when the world has essentially ended.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to jump right into the wreckage. Let's bypass the basic Sunday school history here. We all know the Babylonians burned Jerusalem to the ground in 586 BC, right?
Right.
And we know Cyrus the Great eventually conquered Babylon and let the captives go home. But what I really want to understand is the immediate reality on the ground. Like, what is the Sitzim Leben, the actual setting in life for these returnees? Because they aren't coming back to a sovereign kingdom.
No. Not even close. The Sitzim Leben here is really defined by extreme vulnerability and massive imperial bureaucracy. You have to remember, the Persian Empire was the largest the ancient world had ever seen.
Stretching from India to Egypt, basically.
Exactly. And to manage it, they divided it into these massive administrative regions called satrapies. The returning Jewish remnant is migrating into the satrapy of Abernori, which translates to beyond the river.
Right, meaning everything west of the Euphrates.
Yeah. But within that massive geopolitical zone, they're confined to a microscopic, impoverished, agriculturally devastated subprovince called Yehud.
Yehud. It's like barely a speck on the Persian map.
Barely a speck. And the geopolitical reality is that the surrounding subprovinces, Samaria to the north, Ammon to the east, Edom to the south, they spent the last 70 years treating the ruins of Judah as their own backyard.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so they're not happy.
Not at all. Suddenly, these exiles show up with letters from the Persian king saying, hey, we own this now. It instantly creates a powder keg of local political hostility.
Mm.
And that intense, precarious environment is the exact context for the authorship of this book.
Which brings up a really fascinating debate in the source material. The conservative scholarly framework goes to great lengths to defend Ezra the priest as the primary author and compiler of the book.
Right, dating it somewhere around 440 to 400 BC.
Yeah, and the internal evidence they use to prove this is this really jarring linguistic shift right in the middle of the text.
Yeah, the Ezra memoirs. In Ezra chapter 7, starting around verse 27, the text suddenly stops reading like a third-person omniscient historical chronicle.
It just shifts.
It drops directly into a first-person autobiographical account. It goes from Ezra did this to I did this.
Now, wait, let me play the skeptical historian for a second here.
Go for it.
If I'm reading a book that is half third-person historical narrative, half first-person diary entries, and it's just peppered throughout with official Persian state decrees and endless genealogical lists.
Right, the lists.
Yeah, I'm assuming this is a disorganized patchwork of different documents pasted together much later by some Hellenistic editor, you know. But the source argues that Ezra himself is synthesizing all of this. Why would he write like that? Is he trying to be a historian, or is he acting more as a theologian?
Well, what's fascinating here is that in the ancient Near Eastern framework, the idea that a historian simply records objective, raw data without a theological purpose is, well, it's completely foreign.
Oh, interesting. So the two aren't separate.
Exactly. History is the theater of divine action.
Yeah.
Ezra is doing something highly intentional by weaving these genres together. He is acting as a historian theologian to secure two vital things for a community on the brink of collapse:
Okay, what are those?
political vindication and theological reconstitution.
Okay, political vindication makes sense to me. You include the official Persian receipts to prove to your hostile neighbors, like, look, the emperor stamped this. We have the legal right to build.
Yes.
But what do you mean by theological reconstitution?
Remember the psychological state of the people. They are deeply traumatized, and they are highly susceptible to assimilating into the surrounding pagan cultures because, frankly, those cultures seem to be winning.
Right, their gods seem stronger, physically speaking.
Yeah. So by synthesizing state records with his own firsthand memoirs, Ezra is proving that Yahweh, their covenant God, is the one actually pulling the strings of the Persian Empire.
Wow.
He is rebuilding their identity by showing them that their survival isn't just an accident of imperial policy. It is orchestrated divine providence.
That reframes the whole document. It's really a survival manual masquerading as a history book.
It really is.
But as they piece this history together, our source highlights a few major historical cruxes. There are these massive debates over the timeline and the leaders involved, which honestly look like glaring contradictions if you aren't paying close attention.
Yes, the text can be confusing there.
The first one that caught my eye is the identity of Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel.
Yeah, this is a classic puzzle in biblical scholarship. In Ezra chapter 1, the text introduces a man named Sheshbazzar. He's explicitly called the Prince of Judah, and he's the one who officially receives the stolen temple vessels back from King Cyrus.
Right, to take them to Jerusalem. He's credited with laying the foundation.
But then, just 2 chapters later in chapter 3, a man named Zerubbabel, who is a direct descendant of the Davidic royal line, is the one actually leading the people, organizing the priests, and building the physical foundation of the temple.
So if I'm a critical scholar, I'm circling that in red ink and saying, look, we have two competing leaders. Either there was a political coup or a later editor clumsily smashed two conflicting oral traditions together.
That's the common critical argument, yeah.
So how does the conservative evangelical framework resolve that without doing, like, total mental gymnastics?
It resolves it by looking really closely at the administrative structure of the Persian Pihat, that's the local governorship.
Yeah.
The most historically sound resolution is that Sheshbazzar was an older official Persian-appointed governor.
Okay.
He was the figurehead assigned to lead that first initial wave of returnees in 538 BC and basically handled the legal transfer of the royal treasury. Zerubbabel was his younger nephew, essentially acting as the on-the-ground co-leader.
So Sheshbazzar is the guy with the Persian badge, and Zerubbabel is the guy holding the architectural blueprint.
Exactly. And given the hard conditions of the return, it is highly likely that Sheshbazzar either died shortly after arriving or was just recalled to the Persian court.
Right, he was older.
Yeah. So once the figurehead was gone, Zerubbabel naturally assumed full leadership to execute the actual structural work of the temple. It perfectly preserves the historical accuracy of both accounts.
Chapter 1 is the legal bureaucratic inception under Sheshbazzar. Chapter 3 is the boots-on-the-ground execution under Zerubbabel.
Yeah.
That actually makes perfect logical sense. It's like the difference between the CEO who signs the merger and the project manager who actually integrates the companies.
That's a great way to put it.
Now, there is an even bigger chronological debate the source mentions, the order of Ezra and Nehemiah. I mean, I always assumed Ezra came first, then Nehemiah.
Sure, that's how they are in the canon.
Right, but some critical scholars flip the entire timeline. They argue Nehemiah must have arrived decades before Ezra. What is the logic behind inverting the timeline like that?
The logic of the higher critical scholars, which really gained a lot of traction in the 19th century, is based on a sociological assumption. When Ezra arrives, he implements these massive, sweeping social and religious reforms, right?
Yeah, he commands immense authority.
Exactly. So the critical assumption is, how could Ezra possibly enforce strict, highly unpopular religious laws in a city that was completely exposed and didn't even have physical walls to protect it from local warlords?
Oh, I see.
Therefore, they argue, Nehemiah must have arrived first in 445 BC to build the physical walls and secure the perimeter. Only then, perhaps around 398 BC, could Ezra safely arrive to establish the religious laws.
I have to admit, that sounds incredibly practical. You need physical security, a wall, before you can enforce spiritual laws without causing a riot.
It sounds logical, yes.
So how does the conservative source defend the traditional timeline of Ezra arriving first?
By diving deeply into the linguistic evidence and the Hebrew text itself.
Okay, hit me with the linguistics.
First, the Aramaic used in the Ezra correspondence is a perfect morphological match for 5th century Imperial Aramaic, not the later 4th century developments that a 398 BC date would require.
Okay, so the language itself dates it earlier.
Yes. But even more compelling is the internal textual evidence. In Ezra chapter 9, Ezra praises God for giving the people a wall in Judah.
Ah, so critical scholars used to point to that and say, aha, Nehemiah's wall was already built.
Exactly. But when you look at the original Hebrew, the word Ezra uses there is gator.
And gator doesn't mean a literal stone wall.
No, in this context, it is almost entirely metaphorical. It means a fence or an enclosure, often used poetically in the Old Testament to describe God's divine protection.
Oh, wow.
If Ezra was talking about Nehemiah's massive stone fortifications, he would have used the Hebrew word koma, which is the specific term used throughout the book of Nehemiah for the city walls.
That is fascinating.
So the text actually depicts Ezra exactly as the traditional timeline suggests, sitting in a highly vulnerable, physically unwalled town, relying entirely on the gator, the spiritual and divine protection of Yahweh, to enact his internal reforms.
That is brilliant. So the text is telling us that spiritual reform actually preceded physical security, which is a perfect segue because it mirrors the literary structure of the book itself. Our source points out that whoever compiled Ezra didn't just write a chronological diary. The book has a very deliberate, symmetrical architecture.
Yes, the macro structure is undeniably intentional. It's cleanly divided into two distinct halves.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Chapters 1 through Sinus focus on the architectural restoration. That's the physical rebuilding of the sacred space, the temple, under Zerubbabel.
Right.
Then there is a massive historical gap of almost 60 years. And when we pick up in chapters 7 through 10, the focus shifts entirely to the spiritual restoration. This is the rebuilding of the sacred community, the people themselves, under the leadership of Ezra.
I kept thinking of an analogy as I was reading this part of the source. It's like a family whose house burns down in a terrible fire.
Okay, yeah.
First, you have to clear the ash, pour a new concrete foundation, frame the walls, put on the roof. That's chapters 1 through 6. The physical structure is back, but a house is just an empty shell. If the family moving back into it is completely broken, traumatized, and dysfunctional, the house doesn't matter. You have to establish the rules, the rhythms, and the identity of the people living inside.
Yes.
Fixing the family, the spiritual infrastructure, that's chapters 7 through 10.
That is a phenomenal analogy. And the author highlights that exact dynamic by making both halves of the book follow an identical, recurring narrative loop.
I loved this detail in the source. What is that repeating loop?
Whether they are building the house or fixing the family, the trajectory is the same. In both the architectural half and the spiritual half, the action is initiated by divine intervention via a decree from a Persian king.
Okay, step 1, decree.
Right. Following the decree, the text provides a meticulous, highly detailed list of the returning exiles.
Step 2, the list.
Then, there is an initial moment of great success and liturgical celebration.
Step 3, success.
But immediately following that success, a massive existential crisis erupts that threatens to derail everything.
Step 4.
Crisis. And finally, the crisis is resolved through faithful adherence to God's word.
Decree, list, success, crisis, resolution. It happens with the stones, and it happens with the souls.
Yes. It forces the reader to realize that rebuilding a building and rebuilding a human heart are fraught with the exact same patterns of resistance.
And both require the exact same reliance on divine intervention.
Precisely.
Let's zoom in on that moment of initial success in the first half of the book, because the source zeroes in on Ezra chapter 3 as one of the most emotionally complex scenes in ancient literature.
Oh, it really is.
They've been working in the rubble, clearing the charred stones, and they finally lay the new physical footprint of the Second Temple. And the reaction of the crowd is incredibly visceral.
It is a masterpiece of psychological realism. You have the priests in their vestments, the Levites clashing the cymbals, singing the ancient psalms, and the younger generation, the ones who were born in the dust of Babylon, who have only ever heard stories of a temple, they erupt into massive shouts of pure joy.
To them, this is an unbelievable, miraculous triumph. But then you have the older generation.
The patriarchs, the elderly priests. These are the men who, as young boys 70 years earlier, had actually seen the original Temple of Solomon.
Right.
They remember the towering cedar beams from Lebanon, the sheer volume of gold, the monumental scale of it. And they look at this new foundation.
Yeah. Which is modest.
Yeah, it's relatively small. It's practical.
Right. And the text says they just weep. They weep with a loud voice. The contrast between the glory of the past and the reality of the present just breaks them.
And the detail that gives me chills is what the text says next. It says the sounds of the joyful shouting from the young and the sounds of the bitter, agonized weeping from the old mingled together so loudly that you couldn't tell them apart.
Yeah.
And the noise was heard from miles away. It's such a profound portrayal of what trauma recovery actually looks like. It's never just a neat, tidy Hollywood ending. Our source frames this as the theological tension of the not yet. Can you unpack that? Yeah, the not yet captures the complex, deeply bittersweet reality of restoration in a fallen world. The prophets, guys like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Haggai, they had promised that when God restored his people, the glory of the new temple would far surpass the old one.
Right. The nations would stream to it. The presence of God would physically return.
But the reality standing before them in Ezra 3 was deeply underwhelming. It was a genuine restoration. I mean, they were physically home, but it was not yet the ultimate glorious consummation they were promised.
So the weeping isn't just nostalgia for the good old days. It's a theological disappointment.
Exactly. And the text uses that disappointment brilliantly. It teaches the community that true ultimate restoration isn't going to be found in physical buildings of stone and wood.
Oh, that's good.
The modest temple forces them to keep looking forward, to realize that the grand promises of God must be pointing towards something much larger than a physical building in Jerusalem.
Which brings us to the actual literary mechanics of the book. Whoever wrote this wasn't just telling a sad, beautiful story. They were using highly sophisticated rhetorical strategies.
Yes, very sophisticated.
And one of the most jarring things the source points out is this bizarre literary device, linguistic code switching.
Ah, yes. If you are reading the BHS, the Hebrew Bible, you are reading along in standard biblical Hebrew. And then, right in the middle of chapter 4, verse 8, the language just abruptly switches.
It just drops the Hebrew entirely.
Completely. It shifts into Imperial Aramaic, and it stays in Aramaic for over 2 chapters, through chapter 6, and then switches back and forth again in chapter 7.
Okay, I have to be honest here. Code switching to Aramaic to paste in official, bureaucratic legal transcripts from the Persian court. I mean, that sounds mind-numbingly dry.
It does to a modern reader.
Right. It's like someone writing an epic, sweeping history of a spiritual revival, and right in the middle of the climax, they just staple a PDF of a zoning permit from the IRS into the book. It feels so out of place. How does pasting in official tax and legal transcripts serve any kind of spiritual or theological purpose?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it seems dry to us. But in the ancient context, it is a brilliant, aggressive rhetorical strategy.
How so?
Imperial Aramaic was the lingua franca, the universal administrative and diplomatic language of the entire Achaemenid Persian Empire.
Like English in global business today.
Exactly. If you were doing official state business in Egypt, in Babylon, in India, you used Aramaic. By embedding the actual verbatim Aramaic correspondence between the local governors and the Persian kings directly into the text, the author is doing something profound.
He's pulling back the camera.
Yes, he is taking the tiny, vulnerable, seemingly insignificant province of Yehud and placing it squarely on the grand stage of global imperial administration. He is showing the reader the God of Israel is not some localized tribal deity trapped in the rubble of Jerusalem. He is the God who actively navigates and commands the secular, diplomatic channels of the greatest superpower on earth.
He's telling his readers, we aren't a backwater cult. We have the stamped approval of the emperor because our God rules the emperor.
Exactly.
But wait, didn't scholars used to think those Aramaic letters were totally fake?
Yes. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, critical scholars routinely dismissed the Aramaic sections of Ezra as pious forgeries.
Because they just couldn't believe it was authentic.
Right. They argued that a later Jewish author invented these letters to make his ancestors look more important than they really were. But then, archaeology completely overturned that consensus with the discovery of the Elephantine papyri.
Okay, the source mentions the Elephantine papyri, but we really need to dive into this. What exactly was found, and how did it vindicate Ezra?
It's one of the coolest finds. Elephantine is an island in the Nile River in Egypt. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, archaeologists discovered a massive cache of papyrus documents there.
Just buried in the sand.
Yeah. It turned out to be the archives of a Jewish mercenary colony that had been stationed there by the Persian Empire during the 5th century BC, the exact same time period as Ezra.
Oh, wow.
These papyri contained everyday legal contracts, marriage settlements, and crucially official state correspondence with Persian authorities.
So we suddenly had a time capsule of everyday Achaemenid bureaucracy.
Exactly. And when historical linguists compared the Aramaic from the Elephantine papyri to the Aramaic chapters in the Book of Ezra, they were stunned.
They matched.
Perfectly. The morphology, the vocabulary, the highly specific legal idioms, the structural protocols of how you address a Persian official. It wasn't a later forgery. It was the exact, highly technical administrative language of the 5th century Persian court.
That is incredible.
It absolutely validated the historical authenticity of Ezra's sources. The receipts were real.
A Jewish military outpost in Egypt accidentally proves the grammatical authenticity of the Bible. That is wild.
It's amazing.
Now, alongside the Aramaic code switching, the author also uses a very specific, repeated Hebrew phrase to drive his point home. The motif of the Yod YHWH.
Yes, the Yod YHWH, the hand of the Lord. In the second half of the book, particularly when Ezra is introduced in chapters 7 and 8, this exact phrase is repeated like a drumbeat.
The hand of the Lord his God was upon him.
Over and over, Ezra's journey from Babylon to Jerusalem is incredibly dangerous. He is transporting massive amounts of royal gold and silver across desert trade routes, completely infested with bandits.
Right.
And he explicitly refused to ask the Persian king for a military escort because he had already testified that his God protects those who seek him.
Which is a massive flex, but also terrifying.
Terrifying. But every time Ezra arrives safely, every time the king grants an impossible request, the text inserts the Yod YHWH.
It's a literary device designed to entirely refute the idea of blind chance.
It's exactly. Or secular political benevolence. The Persian king didn't give them gold because he was feeling generous. He gave it because the hand of the Lord actively moved his mind.
Which brings us to, perhaps, the boldest theological claim in the entire book. The source talks about an intertextual subversion comparing the opening verse of Ezra to a famous ancient artifact called the Cyrus cylinder. I want to unpack this because this is where ancient history gets incredibly spicy.
Well, this is one of the greatest examples of ancient theological polemics. The Cyrus cylinder is a football-sized clay cylinder covered in Akkadian cuneiform discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879.
Okay.
It was essentially the Persian Empire's official press release when Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC.
So it's state propaganda.
100%. In this secular artifact, Cyrus makes a massive propaganda claim. He says that the Babylonian high god Marduk was angry with the Babylonian king.
Okay, interesting.
So Marduk searched the earth for a righteous ruler, took Cyrus by the hand, and handed him the city of Babylon peacefully.
So Cyrus rolls into Babylon and says, hey guys, I'm not a conqueror. Your own god Marduk told me to take over. I'm your savior.
Right. It is brilliant psychological warfare.
It really is.
Now, read the opening lines of the Book of Ezra. Ezra 1.1 explicitly says, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus.
Oh, wow.
And then Ezra quotes a decree where Cyrus actually says, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth.
That is a direct head-to-head collision of worldviews.
It is a profound subversion. The author of Ezra is pulling back the curtain of global politics. He is saying to the exiles, the Persian propaganda machine wants you to believe that Marduk or Ahura Mazda or some other pagan deity is running the world, but that is a fiction.
It was Yahweh.
It was Yahweh, your covenant God, who orchestrated the rise of the Persian Empire specifically to redeem you.
It completely reorients their understanding of who is in charge of human history. So we've navigated the geopolitics, we've rebuilt the physical temple, the timeline jumps forward 60 years. We are now in the second half of the book, and we finally meet the man who gives the book its name, Ezra the scribe.
Yes, finally.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The source document points to Ezra 7.10 as the absolute central nervous system of the entire text. What does Ezra 7.10 say, and why is it so monumental?
Ezra 7.10 reads, For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it, and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel.
Okay.
To a modern reader, that might sound like a nice standard religious platitude. But in the context of ancient Israelite history, it represents a monumental seismic shift in how humans interact with God.
A shift from what to what?
A shift from oral, prophetic immediacy to written, textual authority. Think about the pre-exilic period. Before Babylon burned the city, how did God guide his people?
Through the prophets, mostly.
He guided them through anointed kings sitting on a physical throne, and through live, dynamic prophets like Isaiah or Jeremiah, who would stand in the temple courts and declare, Thus says the Lord. The word of God was primarily an oral, living voice, intrinsically tied to a physical location and an institutional monarchy.
But now, the kings are gone. The royal line is reduced to a middle management governor. The Grand Temple is a shadow of its former self, and the prophets are fading out.
Exactly. Post-exile, the classical age of prophecy is coming to a close. So how does the community know what God wants?
Yeah.
Ezra embodies the answer. He is a scribe.
Right.
He doesn't bring a new, spontaneous prophecy. He brings a scroll. The guidance of God permanently shifts to the careful, rigorous study, exposition, and application of a written text, the Torah, the law of Moses.
Wow.
Ezra sets his heart to study the text, to internalize it and practice it personally, and then to teach it systematically to the community. This exact moment is the birth of the text-centered religious life.
The foundation of modern exegesis.
It eventually gives rise to the synagogue system, and ultimately to the modern church's focus on biblical exposition.
He is literally inventing a new way to be a believer. He's saying the anchor isn't a building anymore, and it isn't a king on a throne. The anchor is the book.
Yes.
The text is portable. You can take it anywhere, even back into exile. And man, do they need a portable anchor, because as soon as Ezra arrives in Jerusalem and unpacks his bags, he is hit with a crisis that threatens to destroy everything they've built over the last 60 years.
The crisis of chapters 9 and 10.
Right. The returning exiles, including the priests and leaders, have intermarried with the surrounding nations. Now, we have to pause here.
Yeah, this is heavy.
Because if you read this text today, Ezra's reaction demanding that the men send away these foreign wives and children is incredibly difficult to digest. It instinctively sounds harsh, xenophobic, or like basic racial prejudice. How does the conservative survey course framework explain this crisis without moralizing or ignoring the discomfort of the text?
It is arguably the most difficult passage in the book for modern readers. And the source document is very careful to contextualize it exclusively within the biblical theology of covenant, rather than imposing modern concepts of race or ethnicity onto the ancient text.
Okay, so it's not about race.
Not at all. The crisis is not about biological purity or ethnic exclusionism. We know that because throughout the Old Testament, foreigners like Rahab and Ruth were seamlessly integrated into Israel when they adopted the faith of Yahweh.
Right, Ruth is in the lineage of David.
Exactly. The issue here is spiritual syncretism and absolute covenant survival. In Ezra 9, the text uses a very specific, loaded Hebrew phrase. It says the holy seed, the zerah, has mixed itself with the peoples of the land.
A holy seed. That phrasing definitely feels like a callback to something much older in the canon.
It is a direct canonical callback to the foundational promises of the book of Genesis. God promised Abraham in Genesis 12 that through his seed, all the nations of the earth would eventually be blessed. And in Exodus 19, God calls Israel to be a distinct, set-apart, holy nation for the sake of eventually redeeming the world. The entire purpose of preserving this tiny, vulnerable remnant of Jews through the Babylonian exile was to keep that messianic line, that specific redemptive vehicle intact.
So their existence isn't just about them. They have to survive as a distinct group so that eventually the Messiah can be born from them to bless everyone else.
Yes. And when Ezra arrives, the leaders of the community suddenly realize a terrifying historical parallel. Why did the catastrophic Babylonian exile happen in the first place?
Because of idolatry.
It happened because for centuries, the Israelites had uncritically tolerated and married into the surrounding idolatrous nations. They adopted their gods, their altars, their corrupt practices. It was a spiritual assimilation that brought the judgment of God and the destruction of the city.
And now, just a few decades after returning, standing in the rubble of the punishment they just survived, the priests and the leaders are doing the exact same thing again.
Precisely. The surrounding nations actively worshiped deities that demanded practices abhorrent to Yahweh. If the tiny, fragile Jewish remnant spiritually assimilates now, they will simply vanish into the melting pot of the ancient Near East.
Wow.
Holy seed will be lost, the messianic line will be broken, and the redemptive plan for the whole world will fail.
So Ezra's radical, deeply painful reforms in chapters 9 and 10, establishing these local tribunals to investigate these marriages and enforcing a strict separation, are framed not as an act of racial hatred, but as a desperate emergency spiritual amputation to save the life of the covenant community.
It's an issue of absolute survival. The patient is dying, and he has to cut off the limb.
But this brings us to a really crucial pivot in our analysis. We've talked about the historical mechanics, the Aramaic letters, the architectural structures, the scribal shift. But if you step back and look at the grand storyline of the Bible, what is this all building toward? Because honestly, if the physical temple is rebuilt, but the older generation is crying because it's disappointing, and the people are legally separated, but they are clearly still struggling deeply with sin and assimilation, it feels incredibly unresolved. Where is the hope? The source document talks heavily about canonical corridors and Christological fulfillment.
This raises an important question, arguably the most important theological question of the book. And to answer it, we have to look very closely at the exact language Ezra uses when he reacts to the intermarriage crisis in chapter 9.
Okay.
When Ezra hears about the profound sin of the people, he doesn't just stand up on a soapbox and scream at them. The text says he tears his garments, pulls hair from his head and beard, and sits down in absolute stunned silence until the evening sacrifice.
He's just gutted.
And then he falls on his knees in the pouring rain and he prays.
And the phrasing of that prayer is what really caught my eye. The source emphasizes his use of pronouns.
It is a masterpiece of intercession. Ezra is a righteous man. He personally did not marry a foreign idolatrous wife. He just got to town.
Right, he's totally innocent here.
Yet, throughout the entire prayer, he uses corporate pronouns. Oh my God, I'm ashamed and blush to lift my face to you, for our iniquities have risen higher than our heads. We are in great guilt.
Wow.
He completely identifies with the sin of the people. He places himself in complete, empathetic solidarity with their guilt. He owns the national sin as if he committed it himself.
He doesn't say, Lord, look at what these idiots did. He says, look at what we did.
And in doing so, Ezra exposes the absolute limits of his own legal reformation. Think about it. Ezra can teach the law brilliantly. He can establish strict tribunals. He can enforce physical separation. But as he sits there weeping in the rain, acknowledging that despite all their legal maneuvering, they still have no right to stand before a holy God, it becomes painfully clear that the law cannot change the human heart.
Structural separation is just a temporary bandage.
Exactly. What the community desperately needs isn't just a better scribe. They need a true, ultimate intercessor.
And from the conservative evangelical perspective, this points directly to Jesus Christ.
Exactly. The Book of Ezra builds a profound typological trajectory. It creates a series of historical shadows that anticipate the coming of Christ.
Let's trace those shadows.
Look at what we've uncovered in this deep dive. The physical Second Temple was a bittersweet, temporary shadow. Jesus arrives and declares himself to be the ultimate true temple, the actual place where the presence of God perfectly meets humanity.
Okay, yeah.
Ezra and Zerubbabel led a physical exodus out of Babylon, but they brought the people back to a broken, difficult land. Jesus leads the ultimate spiritual exodus, delivering his people from the captivity of sin and death itself.
And what about Ezra weeping in the rain?
Ezra is a beautiful, moving picture of a priest interceding for his broken people. But Jesus is the perfect high priest. Jesus doesn't just sit in the rain and weep over the sins of his people. He actually takes the full weight of their corporate guilt upon himself on the cross.
He becomes the sacrifice. He does what Ezra could never do. He offers the true substitutionary sacrifice that brings complete forgiveness. He provides the radical internal heart transformation that the external law could only point toward.
Wow. When you frame it like that, it completely changes how you read this ancient historical book. It's not just an administrative log, it's a massive blinking arrow pointing
It
forward.
really is.
So what does this all mean for the listener today?
Yeah.
The final section of our source document focuses on pastoral application, taking these ancient, incredibly complex texts and translating them into practical, equip and inspire points for modern life and leadership in the local church.
Right, grounding it.
Let's break down a few of these key takeaways. The first one the source mentions is the dynamic action of divine stirring.
We saw this clearly in chapter 1 with King Cyrus. The profound takeaway here is that God's sovereign care and his ability to advance his redemptive purposes are not limited to people who already believe in him.
That's a huge point. He can and does actively stir up the spirits of secular leaders, politicians, and cultural authorities to accomplish his will.
Yeah.
For a modern listener living in a culture that might feel chaotic, hostile, or completely indifferent, this is a massive source of confidence. You don't have to panic about the geopolitics of the day because the same God who directed the Persian Empire through an unwitting pagan king is still sovereign over global history right now.
The hand of the Lord is still moving. I love that. The next application point centers around the actual sequence of the rebuilding process back in chapter 3. The source calls it cultic foundations before structural ambitions.
This is a vital lesson for anyone in leadership, whether in a church or honestly even a business. Notice that when the exiles returned to the absolute rubble of Jerusalem, they didn't start by building massive defensive walls.
They didn't put up security first.
Right. They didn't organize large architectural committees or draft a 10-year strategic plan for urban renewal. The very first thing they did, in Ezra 3, was rebuild the altar of burnt offering on its original foundation so they could resume substitutionary sacrifices.
They prioritized worship and dealing with their sin before they laid a single stone for the walls.
Exactly. The theological principle is that all true spiritual renewal, all effective leadership, must start at the altar. It must start with repentance and fellowship with God.
Yeah.
You cannot build lasting spiritual structures on the foundation of clever organizational programs, slick marketing, or ambitious structural goals. Everything must be built on the foundation of the sacrifice.
If the altar isn't right, the walls don't matter. And that leads perfectly into the final application point, which circles back to the central nervous system of the book, the tripartite strategy of Ezra 7.10.
Set your heart to study, to do, and to teach. It is a timeless, perfectly balanced model for life. Study, practice, teach. If you only study the text but never practice it, you become a cold, empty intellectual, or worse, a hypocrite.
Right. All head, no heart.
If you try to practice and lead without deeply studying the text, you fall into a rootless, shallow pragmatism. And if you study and practice but never teach or share it with others, your life becomes an isolated, selfish endeavor.
Ezra shows us that true resilience requires the integration of all three.
Deep devotion to the truth, personal obedience in everyday life, and a commitment to clearly instructing the people around you.
Study it until it changes you, live it so it's real, and teach it so it outlasts you.
Exactly.
Okay, as we bring this deep dive to a close, let's take one last look at the massive landscape we've covered. We started in the devastating ruins of an existential crisis, watching a traumatized people navigate the massive bureaucracy of the Persian Empire.
Yes, starting from zero.
We watched them lay the physical foundations of a temple amidst a heartbreaking mixture of joy and bitter weeping. We saw the brilliant rhetorical strategy of embedding imperial Aramaic state records right into the holy text, proving that God commands the secular world.
And we witnessed the radical shift from oral prophecy to textual authority under Ezra.
Yes, and we sat with him in the rain as he absorbed the corporate guilt of a failing people, a profound shadow pointing directly to the ultimate intercession of Christ.
And through every single chapter, the recurring drumbeat has been the Yad YHWH, the hand of the Lord, which is the ultimate comfort for the listener.
Because true security for these exiles was never found in the physical walls of Jerusalem, and it wasn't found in the temporary benevolence of a Persian emperor.
Right. True security was found in the providential hand of the Lord, actively working in both the massive macro-political shifts of global empires and the intimate micro-details of a dangerous desert journey.
So, as we leave you today, I want to offer one final provocative thought to mull over, something to explore on your own that builds on everything we've just uncovered. We started this deep dive by asking you to imagine returning to a city where all your physical institutions, your temple, your walls, your homes, your government, were completely burned to the ground.
Everything you relied on.
Everything. Ezra revolutionized his culture by shifting their core identity away from a fragile physical location and anchoring it to something portable, text-based, and indestructible.
Word of God.
So ask yourself, if all the visible, comforting structures of your life were stripped away today, if your physical routines, your community buildings, your preferred institutions were suddenly gone, what text, what core, unshakable truth is written deeply enough in your heart to serve as the foundation for your rebuild?
That's a heavy question.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.